Hello and welcome everyone to the Raw Food Immunity Connection Part 3 webinar. We're super excited today to share with you our continued discussion of valuable but often overlooked information on important nutrients for immune function, food sources of them, seldom discussed dietary considerations for creating health from the inside out, and much more. We want you to reach your health goals and are happy to provide you with information that can help you reach them while avoiding dietary pitfalls. This webinar is the third in our 2020 summer webinar series, Transcending What's Trending. We've found in our collective 60 plus years of personal experience, as well as our research, education, course development, and clinical experience working with patients, that it's so easy to be pulled in different directions depending on the prevailing trends in the health world, and that education is the greatest predictor of success on a raw food and plant-based diet. For those of you who don't know us yet, I'm Dr. Rick Dina, and you'll be hearing from Dr. Karen Dina in the second section of this webinar. We're both chiropractic physicians with a strong interest in plant-based and raw food nutrition, and we're board certified and licensed in the state of California. We're the developers of the Science of Raw Food Nutrition series of classes we taught for 10 years in person. We're also the developers and instructors of the updated and expanded Mastering Raw Food Nutrition online and interactive course, which we'll share more about at the end of this webinar. From this and from speaking at many conferences and events over the years, we've become known for our thoroughness and scientific accuracy, our ability to make complex subjects easy to understand, and our encouraging approach that takes unnecessary hurdles out of the way. Now, once we began teaching our curriculum online in 2016, that inspired us to reach out online in other ways also. For the past 5 years in a row, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20, we have hosted raw food plant-based summits where we interviewed successful, healthy, long-term raw vegans and plant-based doctors to share with you how you can be successful on this path over the long term as well. And down there in the bottom right, we are also the authors of the Raw Food Nutrition Handbook. Before we continue, we'd like to let you know that the information and opinions expressed by us in this webinar are not intended to be used as medical advice and should not be used to diagnose or treat any medical condition or as a substitute for individual health care. The webinar is presented with the understanding that we are not liable for misconception, misuse, or adverse effects resulting from its use. Any type of dietary change, nutritional therapy, or fasting should always be undertaken with the supervision of a qualified healthcare practitioner. We may end up being those healthcare providers for you, but watching this webinar alone does not establish a doctor-patient relationship. Having said that, as some of you know who have seen our webinars in the past, in a typical webinar, we start with some background information about Dr. Karen and I. Then we share some sample teaching content, which this year is on immune function, but in past webinars, we've also talked about a wide variety of other topics: ketogenic diets, intermittent fasting, information about sources of nutrients such as B12, iron, zinc, calcium, omega-3s, etc. We've discussed microbiome health, triglyceride levels and lipid profiles in high fruit eaters, calorie density, etc. Then third, we talk about our curriculum content and the details of how we deliver it. And if you're here on a live webinar, we've got some questions and answers at the end. If you're watching the webinar replay or recording, then we don't have that particular part. Now this year, in the interest of time, and due to the extensive nature of how a variety of nutrients are involved in immune system function, combined with Dr. Karen's enthusiasm for this subject material, we're actually going to skip our backgrounds for webinars 2 and 3. You can always go back and watch webinar 1 from June of 2020, and in all the previous years, we also discuss our background. So you want to learn more about us and who you're hearing from, please feel free to go check those out at rawfoodeducation.com on the Mastering Raw Food Nutrition page. In this webinar, I'll provide a summary of what I discussed in our June 2020 webinar about immune system function and some of my clinical experience relating to that. So if what you hear and you see interests you and you want some more details and to see more of the big picture, we would encourage you to go back and watch the recording of the June webinar starting at 17 minutes and 45 seconds in. Unique to this summary, though, is a discussion of if we can really boost our immune system. So I have some thoughts on that and some thoughts about, is that really the best way to think about maximizing our immune function, all things considered? And you'll see I've got a bit more of a holistic perspective compared to just boosting things or thinking that we can do so. After that, Dr. Karen will discuss the ways that vitamins B12 and folate specifically relate to immune system function in addition to how they provide benefit for the body in general. Once she's finished, then we go into our Mastering Raw Food Nutrition online curriculum and how it is delivered. And again, for those of you here live on the webinar, then we have a question and answer session at the end. If you're watching the recording, that part isn't there. So to see which nutrients we cover in each of the 2020 webinars, we can see that in June, webinar number 1, Dr. Karen covered vitamin C, iron, and selenium as they relate to immune function. Webinar 2, she covered vitamin D and zinc. And in this webinar, she will cover vitamin B12 and folate. And once again, not only a little bit about how they relate to the body's health in general, but something specifically about the immune system that even if you've really been around the block with nutrition research for a long time, there's some new pieces of very interesting information in there. Now we can get on to my summary of immune system considerations, but let me just make one comment about that. You'll hear me say several times in the last webinar, but every time I say that, what I really mean is in the June 2020 webinar, and I'll even have a few text prompts for you there in case you forgot. I mentioned in the last webinar that over the past 23 years in clinical practice, I have individually analyzed lab results of several hundred omnivores and several hundred plant-only eaters. One of the key differences between these two groups in lab testing results is that the plant eaters have lower white blood cell counts. This indicates less stress on the immune system and the body in general, and that is good. This was me. We took a look and said I was at 4.3, which is near the lower end of the reference range. And there's some other numbers that we saw last time. So the typical reference range we just saw goes from about 3.5 to almost 11. 7.1 is the center. Now, this isn't published in any textbooks, but based on my clinical experience working with people who eat fruits and vegetables as the foundation of their diet and are eating exclusively plant foods, the range I see is about 3 to 7, 5 being on average. And like we said last time, the shift to the left, meaning that we're not producing as many white blood cells, means there's less stress on the body. There's fewer toxins coming in, so the body doesn't have to make as many white blood cells, and therefore it saves itself the effort and the toxicity, and that is great. Now what that does is it leaves extra capacity for the immune system. So here's a pie chart of our immune system capability, and our immune system always has to monitor and respond to various foreign invaders coming into the body to deal with them. And there's a variety of things that the body has to respond to. Here are just a few over on the right. Now, when we start doing these things in excess, putting more stress on the body, we see that we have increased our tasks of the immune system, therefore decreasing its capacity because it has more to do now. So our body has to work harder, and we tend to see an increase in white blood cells, an increase in temperature, and there's other indicators you can see on lab work about stress on the body. What's interesting is these same type of behaviors over here on the right in red also tend to lead to things like obesity, high blood pressure, and type 2 diabetes, for example, which are risk factors for being susceptible to things like COVID-19. So we have a negative synergy going on there that you could probably do without. So when we stop doing as many of those things, we can recapture some of that immune system capacity because we're not taxing the system as much. And like we said last time, if we really start to clean up our act, so I've crossed out a lot of these things, then we can recapture even more immune system capacity. Now, this whole idea of if we can boost the immune system, some people refer to this as a boost. And here is our look at that. Our position is that when we simultaneously avoid toxic substances found in processed foods, that are concentrated in animal foods, found in recreational drugs, etc., and at the same time provide the body, including the immune system, with the nutrients that it needs, then we have a double whammy of positive synergy to maximize our immune capability and keep us the most protected from foreign invaders. Now, that's a lot different than thinking we can just simply boost the immune system with nutrients. Now, when we get into this boosting mentality, there's a few concerns that come up. Number one, we can get sort of a false sense of security. We continue with our unhealthy habits, and then we figure we can just give ourselves a boost by taking nutrients to compensate, so we're still overtaxing our system. We're still filling these in orange because we haven't really stopped putting stress on the system. And that's at least half the battle, and that goes ignored when you figure you can just boost yourself up taking a bunch of nutrients. And the other sort of semi-related part of that is we get into this remedy mentality where we treat nutrients like drugs, thinking that they are the primary solution to our health concerns. And we figure also if a certain level of a particular nutrient or combination of nutrients can have a positive impact, if those things are good, then more must be better. And that can be very dangerous. So in the last webinar, Dr. Karen talked about iron and immune function, where we need enough, but excessive levels can actually inhibit our immune function. She talked about how the body can compensate for that. So, for example, taking iron is going to be worse, not better, for your immune system and many other parts of the body. Although not directly related to immune function, with this same type of thinking, I think about DHA, the long-chain omega-3 fat that's very, very beneficial for your brain and for various hormones in the body. A lot of people don't have enough of that, so they get some, that's good, but is more better? Actually not. More excessive levels of that can thin your blood so much that you hemorrhage. You can get a hemorrhagic stroke because the blood on the way up to your brain leaks out of the blood vessels and doesn't make it to your brain. That's not good. That's actually really bad. With vitamin D, Dr. Karen's going to speak about that in a few minutes in this webinar, and she's going to talk about how vitamin D helps to regulate the immune system so it doesn't overreact. That's really important. But excessive levels of vitamin D are actually toxic to the body. So for example, when we go out in the sun, our body will only allow a certain amount of vitamin D to be produced. You stay out in the sun twice as long, you won't make twice as much vitamin D. Your body cuts it off at a certain level. But if you overdose on supplements, you don't get that protection mechanism of the body not making excessive amounts, and you can go overboard with supplements and actually get toxic. So more can be worse, and whole foods help keep us in balance Whereas where we can just boost things up with supplements, we run into that issue. So whole natural plant foods such as fruits and vegetables and a few nuts and seeds here and there are super nutrient dense, giving the immune system what it needs nutrient-wise in a balanced, synergistic manner, while simultaneously not containing substances or ingredients that put stress on our systems. In our opinion, that is the way to maximize our immune system capacity and provide the most protection. So we're allowing the immune system and the body to function optimally, and the body gets the credit rather than thinking we can force it to perform the way we want with external supplements. And that's very much a holistic model versus a partialistic, more medical remedy mentality model that most people are in to their detriment. Now, like the extended version of this discussion in the June 2020 webinar, to end on this slide, we will show that a typical immune system capacity is shown here in gray. Okay, this is when people are overtaxing their system, they're not providing the nutrients that they need, and they have a certain capacity. We can compare that to the much greater blue immune system capacity when we achieve the high nutrient, low toxin synergy of healthy, whole food, plant-based eating, especially when that's centered around fresh fruits and vegetables. And we can see here what a dramatic difference there is. So if COVID-19 or a future worse virus enters your system, or just for general health and optimal well-being, which immune system chunk of the pie would you like to have? And when we also consider that the same practices that allow our immune systems to function at peak capacity also allow us to avoid heart disease, strokes, angina, TIAs, dementia, diabetes, hypertension, autoimmune disease, aches, pains, premature aging, the side effects of the pharmaceutical medications that people take as a result of not doing the right things, as well as brain fog, being overweight, sluggishness, etc. And instead, these things help to optimize your weight, your energy, your blood pressure, your blood sugar, your mental clarity, your athletic endeavors, your energy, and your overall well-being, then the great news is you have a huge amount of control over all of this at the same time by your daily choices. Next, Dr. Karen will discuss the benefits to the immune system of vitamins B12 and folate and show us how these nutrients can fit into the context of whole food plant-based diets centered around fresh fruits and vegetables.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Rick. Now, as you know, there's been a lot of talk about nutrition and immunity as of late, and as a result, I have spent quite a bit of time researching the diet-immunity connection and the different nutrients that have been linked to immune system function. And I have to say, I have learned quite a bit. In fact, I was thinking that I could share the basics of what I've learned in just one webinar. And as it turns out, even the basics could really fill volumes. So as a result, this is the third webinar that we've created on this topic. So this is the Raw Food Immunity Connection Part 3. Now, we covered vitamin C in Part 1, so let's just do a quick recap here. Vitamin C is important for a variety of different aspects of immune function, including the creation and activity of certain white blood cells, including neutrophils, monocytes, T cells, B cells, and NK cells. Maybe you've heard of some of those immune system cells. Essentially, vitamin C helps these immune system cells do their job better. Vitamin C is also necessary for the creation of collagen, which is one of the building blocks for many of the structures in our body. And for these reasons, I think of vitamin C as being the great builder. Now, in Part 2 of the Raw Food Immunity Connection, we talked about vitamin D as being the great modulator of immune function. Now, essentially, vitamin D is important for keeping certain aspects of the immune system or our immune response in check. end. We want our immune system to work well and appropriately, but we don't want it to overreact, because when it overreacts, it can cause excess damage to our own tissues. Now, it's good that our immune system cells produce things like free radicals and other substances that help to fight off pathogens, but too many free radicals can cause damage. Now, in addition to modulating immune function, vitamin D also has some building functions. It's involved in the production of certain immune system cells like monocytes and macrophages. It increases the production of anti-inflammatory factors and antimicrobial proteins that can directly kill pathogens. So vitamin D has a number of important functions. Now in part 2, we also talked about zinc as a so-called gatekeeper of immune function. And I know that in the popular media and on the internet, there's been a lot of talk about zinc as being important for immune function, with good cause. I actually think about zinc as being the great communicator of immune function because of its involvement in communication within and between immune system cells and other cells of our body. It's really important that our immune system cells be able to communicate so that they can have a coordinated immune function, so that they can be very effective at what they do. Now, if you'd like to learn more about these nutrients in relation to immune function and general health, you can check out the replays to parts 1 and 2 of the Raw Food Immunity Connection on our website, rawfoodeducation.com. All right, so next we're going to talk about vitamin B12. I kind of see vitamin B12 as being the unsung hero of immune function. And here's why. Vitamin B12 is known by its scientific name, cobalamin. It's essential since the body does not make it, and it's needed for important body functions, including the formation of every single cell in our body, including immune system cells, because it's involved in genetic code, DNA, and RNA replication. When a cell divides to form a new cell, all of the DNA from the mother cell must be replicated perfectly for the daughter cell, and vitamin B12 plays an important role in this process. Now, vitamin B12 is also involved in the maintenance of the covering of nerve cells called our myelin sheath. Myelin helps with the propagation of nervous system signals through neurons, and in a vitamin B12 deficiency, that myelin can become disrupted, leading to neurologic symptoms. Vitamin B12 is also involved in serotonin production, and serotonin is a neurotransmitter or brain biochemical involved in creating the moods of happiness. Vitamin B12 also keeps homocysteine levels appropriately low. Homocysteine is related to heart disease, and vitamin B12 helps to break it down. Now, I know that vitamin B12 is a huge topic of conversation in the plant-based community, but I'd like to mention that vitamin B12 deficiency is not just an issue for people on plant-based and raw food diets, and my classic example is the Framingham Offspring Study. Now, this study was published in the year 2000, so this information is not new. It's been around for quite some time, and it's very well understood. In this study, there were almost 3,000 people, and 39% of them were in the low, normal, or deficient range for vitamin B12. And what was fascinating about this study was that the participants were not vegetarian, they weren't vegan, or raw foodists. They were all omnivores. They were all eating animal foods. Now, this oftentimes surprises people because animal foods are thought to be good or reliable sources of vitamin B12. We've all heard that, right? But this study shows us otherwise. Vitamin B12 is a concern for everybody. Now, I tend to actually be more concerned about vitamin B12 with omnivores than I am with plant-based eaters because plant-based eaters tend to be well educated about vitamin B12. Now, very often, I'm asked about food sources of vitamin B12 and how reliable they are. Before we move forward, we need to establish, though, that vitamin B12 is made by bacteria. And supposedly there's over 365 known species of bacteria that produce vitamin B12. And some of these bacteria can actually live in soil. So, what about plants? Are plants a reliable source of vitamin B12? That's a very good question. Unfortunately, the answer is no, because the bacteria that produce vitamin B12 can live in soil, but it's thought that for a number of reasons, the bacteria that produce vitamin B12 are not reliably found in agricultural soils. So if the bacteria that produces that B12 is not present in that soil, then it's not going to be in those plants. Now, are fermented foods a good source of vitamin B12? Can these foods have B12 in them? The answer is that some fermented foods have B12, but not all. So fermented foods are not considered to be a reliable source of B12. Since vitamin B12 is made by certain types of bacteria, the fermentation mixture would have to contain that bacteria, which is not reliably the case, unfortunately. Most studies that I've seen have shown that fermented foods are not a reliable source of B12. Now, what about sea vegetables? Are sea vegetables a reliable source of B12? Unfortunately, they're not. Studies that I've seen that were done on nori seaweed revealed that freshly harvested nori contains human bioactive vitamin B12, but once the nori has been dried, the human bioactive B12 is converted into B12 analogs. Now, B12 analogs are molecules that look like human bioactive B12, but don't have the same activity in the human body. Unfortunately, rehydrating the nori does not reactivate the B12. This is likely where some of the confusion with vitamin B12 and sea vegetables comes from. Now, what about spirulina and chlorella? I remember when I first got started with raw food years ago, I was told that they were good sources, but unfortunately not, since they too have been found to contain vitamin B12 analogs that look like human bioactive B12, but do not act like it in the body. So we know that vitamin B12 can be made by bacteria. Now, can the bacteria that produces vitamin B12 be found in our digestive tract? The answer is yes. The bacteria that produces human bioactive B12 can live in our large intestine. And if we take a look up here on the screen, we can see a stylized picture of our digestive tract. And our large intestine is this green structure right here that I'm pointing out. And our small intestine is this orange structure. So we can have bacteria that produces human bioactive B12 living in our large intestine. The challenge, though, is that B12 is absorbed in our small intestine, the last part of our small intestine called the distal ileum. Now, the vitamin B12 that is produced in our large intestine unfortunately cannot move backwards into our small intestine because things tend to move one way in our digestive tract. We don't really want things from our large intestine moving backwards into our small intestine. We also have an ileocecal valve that is in between the large and small intestine that can prevent backflow. So unfortunately, the vitamin B12 made by bacteria in our large intestine cannot make it back to our small intestine. And so therefore, our body cannot make use of that vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is not absorbed in our large intestine. Once again, it's absorbed in the last part of our small intestine, our distal ileum. Now, if we had a way to be able to actually absorb the vitamin B12 made in our large intestine, then we wouldn't be having all these conversations about vitamin B12 deficiency, because our body would be able to utilize and absorb that vitamin B12 from our large intestine if our large intestine was able to absorb it. But that's just not the case, unfortunately. So what it comes down to is that the vitamin B12 made in our large intestine is not a reliable source of vitamin B12 for us. So, what's the most reliable source of B12? The answer is supplementation. Now, if someone has trouble absorbing or is very deficient in vitamin B12, their doctor may have them get an injection. Now, there are several different forms of vitamin B12 available in supplements, and here's a sampling. Hydroxycobalamin, methylcobalamin, cyanocobalamin, and adenosylcobalamin, and maybe you've heard of some of these. First, we'll take a look at hydroxycobalamin. Now, hydroxycobalamin is the form of vitamin B12 that is made by bacteria. We just talked a few minutes ago about how vitamin B12 can be made by bacteria. So this is the form of vitamin B12 that's made by bacteria. An interesting thing to note about it, though, is that it's not a human bioactive form. So if somebody eats a food with hydroxycobalamin in it or takes a hydroxycobalamin supplement, the body takes the hydroxy portion of the molecule off and replaces it with a methyl group, which then activates it. It creates methylcobalamin. Now, methylcobalamin is a human bioactive form of vitamin B12, and we'll talk about it in just a couple minutes. Hydroxycobalamin from natural and supplemental forms can be converted into methylcobalamin in the human body, and the body does do that if it's able to methylate well. So next, let's talk about methylcobalamin. Now, methylcobalamin is a human bioactive form of vitamin B12, and it's involved in a number of methylation reactions in our body. Methylcobalamin is available in supplemental form, and it is human bioactive, as we've mentioned. Next, let's talk about cyanocobalamin. Cyanocobalamin is one of the most common supplemental forms. Lots of studies have been done on it. It has a long shelf life, so supplement manufacturers like to make it because it can sit on a shelf for years and still work, whereas many other forms may not have as long of a shelf life. Now, cyanocobalamin is a synthetic form of vitamin B12, and it's made exclusively in a laboratory. Cyanocobalamin is not human bioactive, so it needs to be converted to be used by our body. So both cyanocobalamin and hydroxycobalamin need to be converted into a human bioactive form in order for them to be able to work in our body. Now, methylcobalamin is already human bioactive in the form that you get from supplements. Now, what form of vitamin B12 do we use? We use methylcobalamin, which we've been using for years and have experienced good results. One way to know if your vitamin B12 supplement is working or if you're getting enough from your diet is to get a vitamin B12 test, which Dr. Rick is going to explain shortly. Lastly, I would like to touch on adenosylcobalamin. This is one of the lesser well-known forms of vitamin B12. What's interesting about it, though, is that adenosylcobalamin is one of the human bioactive forms. So we've talked about methylcobalamin as being a human bioactive form. So is adenosylcobalamin. Hydroxycobalamin is made in nature by bacteria, but it's not human bioactive. It needs to be converted. Cyanocobalamin is made in a laboratory and is not human bioactive. So our body needs to convert it in order to be human bioactive. Getting back to adenosylcobalamin, the other forms of cobalamin can be transformed into adenosylcobalamin when necessary. An interesting thing to note about adenosylcobalamin is that it is a storage form of vitamin B12. Now, vitamin B12 can be stored in our liver. So when vitamin B12 is stored in our liver, it is stored in the form of adenosylcobalamin. Now, the other forms are more popularly found in supplemental forms, but I'm starting to see more adenosylcobalamin supplements. As I just mentioned, adenosylcobalamin is the storage form of vitamin B12, and it's used in energy production, like other B vitamins. Maybe you've heard of the energy Bs. This is one of the reasons why vitamin B12 is grouped with the other B vitamins, because it's involved in the production of energy. And adenosylcobalamin is also involved in keeping levels of methylmalonic acid in our body appropriately low. So what is methylmalonic acid? During the breakdown of protein, fat, and cholesterol, our body forms this substance called methylmalonyl-CoA. Now, with normal vitamin B12 status, vitamin B12 then breaks down methylmalonyl-CoA into succinyl-CoA, which then goes into the Krebs cycle for energy production. Now, the form of B12 that makes this conversion is adenosylcobalamin. Now, other names for the Krebs cycle that you might have heard are the TCA cycle, the citric acid cycle, and the tricarboxylic acid cycle. So what happens when we're low in vitamin B12? This pathway is affected. And what happens is methylmalonyl-CoA starts to accumulate, and it isn't able to be converted into succinyl-CoA and then to go into the Krebs cycle as it normally would. So then what happens to that methylmalonyl-CoA is that it's converted into methylmalonic acid. Methylmalonic acid is also a popular vitamin B12 test, and it's also been referred to as one of the best functional indicators of human bioactive B12 status. So next, Dr. Rick is going to talk about methylmalonic acid and some other vitamin B12 tests. So take it away, Dr. Rick.
There are a number of different tests that can be utilized to determine the B12 status of a patient. We see 4 of the major ones on the slide here, and each one has their advantages and their disadvantages. The complete blood count, otherwise known as full blood count or hemogram, let's start out with that. So Dr. Karen mentioned that vitamin B12 is involved in creation of new cells. Because we have 25 to 30 trillion red blood cells, and they need to be replaced every 4 months. That is, those millions and millions of new red blood cells need to be replaced every single day. If you are low in B12 and you don't have enough B12 to activate folate to produce new cells, a low red blood cell count is usually the first major place that that problem can be detected. For a couple of other reasons, or different reasons, the size of your red blood cells gets big. So if you are anemic from iron deficiency, we mentioned the size of your red blood cells gets small. If you are anemic from B12 deficiency, the size of your red blood cells gets big, and that's a major distinguishing factor between those 2 major types of anemia. Now, Dr. Karen made a video on her YouTube channel showing that even if you are low in B12, if you consume much larger quantities of folate than the average person, which those of us eating raw fruits and vegetables is the foundation of our diet do, you can actually have enough activated folate even without B12 to keep pumping out new red blood cells, and you can head off that potential problem with anemia. Now, on the one hand, that sounds good, but on the other hand, that's not so good because you think everything's fine, and then years down the road, you can end up, if you're low in B12, with one of those major neurological problems that Dr. Karen mentioned, and you don't want to deal with any of those. I've seen some of those clinically, and they are not at all good. Maybe my favorite test here, one of them is serum B12. Sounds straightforward enough. Actually measure your B12 level. Now, the problem with that is that if somebody's consuming foods like spirulina, for example, that may contain B12 analogs, the test can get fooled, and B12 levels will look good in your blood, but those analogs don't actually function like B12. So over on the right, we have some of the fancier B12 tests that measure the functional status of vitamin B12. And the first one here is homocysteine. Homocysteine is supposed to be low. When you're deficient in B12 or B6 or folic acid, and there's some other considerations as well, homocysteine gets elevated. That's a problem because homocysteine irritates and causes inflammation in our blood vessel walls, and that can lead to vascular disease. It's a major contributing risk factor for vascular disease, which can lead to heart attacks, strokes, claudication, TIAs, angina pain, erectile dysfunction, and other things that people can do without. So if homocysteine's elevated, you don't know for sure which one of these nutrients you're low in. But in my practice, because I deal with mostly vegans and raw vegans, it's pretty unlikely you're going to be low in folate or B6, so you're pretty sure at that point it's B12. Now, if homocysteine is low, then you know your status of all three of these nutrients, including B12, is excellent. Lastly, we have methylmalonic acid, which can be measured in the blood or the urine, and unlike homocysteine, B12 is the only nutrient that affects methylmalonic acid. B12 is involved in demethylating, taking a methyl group off of methylmalonic acid. So if methylmalonic acid is elevated, you know that your B12 status is not good, even if your serum B12 level says it's okay, because you might be getting fooled by analogs there. So methylmalonic acid is a very sensitive indicator, and it is very useful, and I use all of these tests in my clinical practice depending on the situation. Now, one other thing I'd like to mention for serum B12 is that if your vitamin B12 status is good or it's excessive, homocysteine and methylmalonic acid will both be appropriately low. They can't tell the difference between enough B12 and an excessive amount. Neither can the CBC. But the serum B12 test can tell you that. So if you see really high levels of B12, well, that's not going to be harmful because B12 is water soluble and it's not toxic, but it may mean you're over supplementing and you can save yourself some money and some plastic going to the recycling center by cutting back on your vitamin B12 level. So that can really help you dial things in. There's so much more to talk about each of these tests in relationship to vitamin B12, but we hope you have enjoyed this little bit of an overview, and in combination with what Dr. Karen taught us, you're a little bit more educated now about the importance of vitamin B12 and how to test for it so you know if your status is good or if it's not so good.
Next, I would like to spend a few minutes talking about folate. Since folate, like vitamin B12, plays an important role in immune function and in our general health. And also like vitamin B12, I see folate as being an unsung hero of immune function because of some of the really important things it does in our body for the immune system and for a variety of other functions as well. The term folate is actually derived from the word foliage, which is really fitting because leafy greens can be a good source of folate. Now, another name for folate, the actual scientific name for it, is vitamin B9, which means that folate is a B vitamin, and as such, it's water soluble. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a couple of minutes. Folic acid is also an important form of vitamin B9. Now, folate is a naturally occurring form of vitamin B9 that's found in whole natural plant foods, such as fruits and vegetables, especially leafy greens, as we'll talk about in just a couple minutes. Now, folic acid is a form of vitamin B9 that is primarily found in supplements, and I've heard it referred to as being the synthetic form of vitamin B9, whereas folate is referred to as the natural form because it's found in whole natural foods. So what does folate actually do in our body? That's a really good question. It has a number of important activities and is essential, which means that our body does not make it, and it's needed for critically important functions. So, how does folate support immune function? It's involved in the function of NK cells, also known as natural killer cells, which are immune system cells that we mentioned in parts 1 and 2 of the Raw Food Immunity Connection. An interesting thing to note is that vitamin B12 is also important for NK cell function, and so are some of the other important nutrients that we've mentioned. Now, folate is also involved in antibody response to antigens. Now, what does that actually mean? Let's just say, for example, that we have a pathogen. Now, pathogens are sometimes referred to as antigens. So if we have an antigen present, then our antibodies will create an immune response, and folate plays an important role in this process. Folate is also involved in the function of helper T cells, and maybe you've heard of helper T cells in the past. They are cells that are important for immune function in our body. Now, folate is also important for DNA replication, which is necessary for the creation of cells, essentially every single cell in our body, including immune system cells. So, how does folate actually do this? Now, up here on the slide, I have a representation of the pathway that folate takes in order to participate in DNA synthesis or DNA replication. So, here we have some folate, and right next to folate here, I have a picture of leafy greens because folate is well known to be found in leafy greens. So, when we consume foods that contain folate, what happens is that folate goes through a couple of conversions to create the substance here called tetrahydrofolate. And tetrahydrofolate is then converted into 5,10-methylene tetrahydrofolate, which then goes into DNA synthesis. Now, it's not really that important to know the names of these substances. Just know that folate is converted into a few different intermediates before it goes into DNA synthesis. Now, the interesting thing to note here is that folate can also take another pathway where it's converted into a substance called 5-methyltetrahydrofolate. And here's 5-methyltetrahydrofolate up here. So, in addition to folate following this pathway into DNA synthesis, an alternative pathway is for folate to be converted into 5-methyltetrahydrofolate. And then what happens is that vitamin B12 then actually takes the methyl group off of 5-methyltetrahydrofolate, which it then uses to inactivate a substance called homocysteine that maybe you've heard of. Now, I'm not actually showing the transfer here of that methyl group to homocysteine. That's actually something that I cover in our Mastering Raw Food Nutrition class. But the bottom line here is that vitamin B12 is involved in this reaction that takes a methyl group off of 5-methyltetrahydrofolate in order to regenerate tetrahydrofolate. And this is how vitamin B12 is involved in DNA synthesis and replication. It's really fascinating how there's different pathways that a nutrient can take depending on the needs of the body. So this is actually one of the ways where vitamin B12 is very important for the formation of cells in our body. So once again, when we eat food that contains folate, folate is converted in the body into a few different intermediates and then goes into DNA synthesis. Now, why is it important for our body to create DNA? That's a very good question. The reason why is because this DNA is important for cell replication. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier that vitamin B12 and folate are both important for creating every single cell in our body because folate and vitamin B12 are involved in the replication of DNA. Now, every single time that our body wants to create a new cell, the DNA of the parent cell or the cell from which the new cell is going to be created, must be perfectly replicated during the cell division process. Folate and vitamin B12 play a very important role in that replication. Now, what cells are we actually talking about when we say every single cell in our body? Now, here are a few examples. We've got some bone cells, we've got some red blood cells, we have some immune system cells, and lots of other types of cells as well. Now, earlier we said that folate and vitamin B12 can be thought of as the unsung heroes of immune function. And one of the main reasons why is because they're actually involved in the creation of immune system cells as well as other cells in our body. Now that we've talked about why folate is so important, let's take a look at some food sources of folate. Now, leafy greens are generally known as being good sources of folate. And I'm a big fan of knowing for sure. So let's take a look at some leafy greens here that are popular in the raw food and plant-based communities. Now, I also have a couple of popular types of sprouts for comparison. I've got sprouted peas and lentils, as you can see up here on the table. At the bottom of the screen, we have the adult daily value for folate. Now, that's the actual recommended dietary allowance for folate, which is 400 micrograms for both men and women. For pregnancy, that number is actually higher. So if you're interested in learning more about folate and other nutrients for pregnancy, I would suggest that you contact an appropriate healthcare provider. Now, as we can see on this table, certain leafy greens can be a significant source of folate, especially when they are eaten in quantity. Now, I've included serving sizes that I have observed raw food and plant-based enthusiasts eat. However, I would like to point out the measurement for one head of romaine lettuce of 626 grams. Now, when you think of one head of romaine lettuce, you may not necessarily be thinking of one that's as large as 626 grams. That's actually a very large head of lettuce. Now, if you see heads of romaine lettuce in the grocery store, very often they're smaller than that. But sometimes the heads of romaine lettuce that Dr. Rick and I actually get at our wholesale produce distributor can be as large as 626 grams. So I would say that if you're going to compare what I'm talking about here to your actual head of lettuce, it would be good for you to actually weigh your head of lettuce to see how much it weighs and then adjust the amount of folate accordingly. Now, from 626 grams of romaine lettuce, we see 851 micrograms of folate. That is really impressive, especially when we compare it to the adult daily value for folate. Cauliflower, spinach, sprouted green peas, and broccoli, all of these foods contain a significant amount of folate per serving. The rest of the foods on this table contain lesser but notable amounts of folate. Romaine lettuce, cauliflower, sprouted green peas, broccoli, and spinach are really the stars of the show on this table when it comes to folate content. And if there are other types of leafy greens or vegetables that you really like to eat, you can check out the folate content for your own interest. Now, what about fruit? One does not generally think of folate when thinking of fruit. Usually one thinks of fruit as being a good source of antioxidants or maybe vitamin C or potassium. But there's a lot more going on with fruit than meets the eye. So let's talk a little bit about certain fruits and the folate content of them. We have a variety of different popular fruits that are consumed in the raw food community. Things like papaya, mango, orange, cantaloupe, strawberries, pomegranate, avocado, banana, kiwi fruit, and raspberries. And there's lots of other fruits that have folate in them, but these are some of the ones that I've found to have the highest folate content. Now on this table, we have the folate content per serving listed here, since people often want to know the nutrient content of the quantities of food that they actually eat. Now, it is important to mention that a significant percentage of raw food enthusiasts eat fruit in greater quantities than this. So if you're one of them, please feel free to adjust the folate content for the amount of these foods that you actually eat. Honestly, the first time I ran the numbers for fruit and folate content, I was pleasantly surprised to see that these numbers were higher than anticipated. The bottom line here is that fruit generally is not as strong of a source of folate as leafy greens, but it's still quite worthy of consideration and in some cases can be quite impressive. Yeah, for example, if we take a look here at 2 cups of chopped papaya, 107 micrograms of folate, mango, 1.5 cups chopped, 107 micrograms, 2 oranges, 94 micrograms. That's pretty darn good. Now, it's interesting to take a look at the amount of folate per serving size, but what about per calorie? So what I have up here on the screen right now is a table with the folate content of fruit per 100 calories so that you can take a look from a per calorie standpoint. And as we can see here, per 100 calories, the amount of folate for papaya, mango, and oranges, cantaloupe, and strawberries is pretty good. And then if we take a look at some of the vegetables that we looked at previously, as you can see, per 100 calories, leafy greens and some of these vegetables that we have here are generally higher in folate. Like for example, per 100 calories for romaine lettuce, we've got 803 micrograms of folate. Per 100 calories for cauliflower, we've got 228 micrograms. For spinach, we have 843 micrograms. And then pak choi here, 507 micrograms. So when we compare that to fruit per 100 calories, we can see that these vegetables and sprouts are considerably higher. But that doesn't mean that fruit isn't impressive. When eaten in quantities, it certainly can be. Now, what about nuts and seeds? We talked about these nuts and seeds up here on the table as being good sources of a variety of different minerals in the previous 2 webinars, the Raw Food Immunity Connection Part 1 and 2. Now, as we can see here, the amount of folate in these nuts and seeds is what I would call contributory. In other words, these nuts and seeds are not going to be the main source of folate on a raw food or plant-based diet. Sunflower seeds, hemp seeds, walnuts, sesame seeds, pumpkin seeds, chia seeds, almonds, and cashews. In some cases, like with sunflower seeds, there's actually a decent amount of folate. But then in the case of cashews, the amount of folate can actually be quite low per serving. It looks like we actually have to eat nuts and seeds in quantity in order to get a significant amount of folate. But most people don't do that because, as we know, the amount of fat from nuts and seeds can really add up very quickly when we start to eat them in quantity. So in the smaller quantities that people tend to eat, folate content is certainly not as high as what we see in some vegetables and leafy greens as we saw previously. For comparison purposes, here is the folate content per 100 calories for these nuts and seeds. And when we compare these numbers to leafy greens, we can see a significant general difference between the leafy greens and the nuts and seeds, per calorie and per serving. So let's just do a quick comparison here. We're looking per 100 calories at these vegetables here. We're seeing numbers in the 800s for romaine lettuce and spinach, 500 here for pak choi. And then if we go back and we take a look at the nuts and seeds per 100 calories, we're seeing numbers of 39 micrograms for the shelled sunflower seeds, and then the amounts just go down from there. So once again, as we can see, the vegetables and leafy greens really are the stars of the show when it comes to folate, per calorie and per serving. Next, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about folate and its susceptibility to damage by heat. Now, earlier in this presentation, I talked about how folate is a water-soluble B vitamin. Since it's water-soluble, folate has a tendency to be damaged by heat, kind of similar to certain other B vitamins and vitamin C. Now, what does the research say? This one particular study looked at spinach leaves and broccoli florets, and it compared the difference in folate loss between boiling and steaming. So 2 different cooking methods. Now, in the spinach leaves, 51% of the folate was lost when boiled for 5 minutes. 58% was lost after boiling for 10 minutes, and 68% was lost after boiling for 15 minutes. However, the steaming of spinach leaves for 5 to 15 minutes resulted in no significant decrease in folate. This is really interesting to know because oftentimes people will ask me if there's a difference in nutrient loss between different cooking methods, and the answer to that is yes, there can be. It really depends on the cooking method and it depends on the food. With boiling, what we see here is significant folate loss, at least in spinach, for 5, 10, and 15 minutes. For broccoli florets, we see that boiling for 5 minutes resulted in the folate loss of about 48%. 56% was lost in 10 minutes, and 65% was lost after 15 minutes. Now, what about steaming? Steaming of the broccoli florets resulted in no significant decrease in folate after steaming for 5 to 15 minutes. Very interesting, and this information mirrors the outcomes of other studies that I've seen. As we can see, not all cooking methods are created equal. So what does this mean for day-to-day life? What this comes down to is that if you're thinking about cooking foods that are a good source of folate, it's good to enjoy them raw or to use a cooking method that's going to result in little or no folate loss. In this case, we talked about steaming as resulting in no significant decrease in folate, whereas boiling can result in significant folate loss. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground in this webinar and in the previous 2 webinars. And we've only really started to scratch the surface of what nutrients and dietary aspects are important for creating general health. And healthy immune function is just one of those benefits. As we've seen, many of these nutrients work together synergistically, so it's important to understand them in context and how to nourish ourselves to realize our greatest health potential. What it really comes down to is whole natural plant foods contain many of these nutrients in a whole food complex. These foods also contain a symphony of phytochemicals with complementary and supplementary activities in our body that support our health with identified health benefits and in many ways that we have yet to fully understand. This is one of the reasons why Dr. Rick and I love to teach our classes like Mastering Raw Food Nutrition and bringing webinars like these to you because there's so much wonderful information out there on the benefits of eating whole natural plant foods. And lastly, I'd like to say that important supplements like vitamin B12 and vitamin D can be supplemental. But the bottom line is we want to focus our diet on whole natural plant foods that contain important nutrients like the ones we mentioned in these webinars and so many others. Now, Dr. Rick is going to share with you a little bit more about our Mastering Raw Food Nutrition class. So take it away, Dr. Rick.
In today's webinar, we presented just a tiny fraction of the information available to those of you who would like to continue your journey learning with us. Before we tell you more about how you can do that, we'd like you to consider the theme of our webinar series from this year and last year, which is transcending what's trending. Now, there's been a lot of talk lately, very justifiably, about our immune systems. But when this particular crisis that we're in now becomes less of an issue, having a strong immune system is still going to be extremely important. And because the same nutrients and the same healthy eating considerations apply to so many other systems of the body that all work together synergistically, these same considerations make sense to focus on for your best health and well-being across the board for a lifetime. We truly want all of you to be trend-proof. Why? Because for those of us who are motivated and willing to make meaningful dietary and lifestyle changes, misinformation is probably the single largest hurdle to the process of achieving excellent health. No matter what you eat, there's someone out there to tell you why it's bad for you. But when you're really well educated, you are much less susceptible to the misinformation throwing you off track. And with all that stuff coming at us today, it's more important than ever to be well educated. And as far as the misinformation goes, this issue is going to only continue to get worse over time. So we all need to know what to do, and we need to be confident in it so we keep building and experiencing our best health consistently. And when you have that level of education that leads to that level of confidence, you can truly achieve a lifetime of supercharged health. Our curriculum, Mastering Raw Food Nutrition, based on our 30 plus years of personal, clinical, research, teaching experience, is designed to do just that. It's a year long, and our next program begins on August 26th, 2020. Our typical student spends about 4 hours per week with the course material. So if you're one of those people out there who's willing to put in a few hours a week for an entire year and cover the financial commitment, which is a few $1,000s, you can dramatically increase your chances for success and very much enjoy the learning process. So I'll first tell you about the topics we cover in this course, and then I'll go into how it's actually delivered. So the topics, boy, this is going to take a few minutes just to read off the topics that we cover. There's a huge array of things we cover in this curriculum. Pretty much everything you need to know about plant-based and raw food nutrition. We start out by covering calorie density, such an important concept, and being absolutely fluent in that is critical to so much of the rest of understanding. So we start off with a bang. Dr. Karen covers the basics of nutrition to give an overview of things to come. Blood sugar regulation, one of my favorite topics. Raw food sources of nutrients, including calcium, vitamin D, vitamin B12. Essential fats, which tie into blood sugar so much. Acid-alkaline balance, cleansing and detoxification, and not just the old-time rhetoric, but up-to-date science about how all of this stuff works together. Where do you get your protein? Of course, we need to cover that. Essentials of human digestion. Enzymes. And by the way, you've got the pro-enzyme raw food rhetoric. You've got the anti-raw rhetoric. Oh, all enzymes just get destroyed by hydrochloric acid, so therefore it doesn't matter. And as it turns out, both of those points of view of rhetoric are quite incomplete. And the real truth is what Dr. Karen shares with you in this class based on being up on all the facts and putting it together. Longevity and youth extension. We get into some really cool science there about how you can apply these principles to maximize your quality and quantity of life. We cover health statistics, so you know what's causing trouble and how to avoid it. The history of raw and living foods. We cover the foundations of why different camps of raw foodists think the way they do and the history behind it. Dr. Karen looks at two approaches and the nutrient concerns there, foundations of the raw food diet, food combining, raw food and weight loss, classic studies in support of plant-based nutrition. We look at McDougall and Pritikin and the Framingham Heart Study and the China Study and Esselstyn and Ornish. and all the classics there, and we lay the foundation for the importance of whole natural plant foods. We then go on to look at the additional benefits of more fresh fruits and vegetables in your diet. So for example, when you're not cooking food, you're avoiding various carcinogens that we mentioned briefly that can stress your immune system, for example. We go into more of the effects about heating on food, from what happens to your food when you cook it from a nutrient perspective. And of course, we cover beta carotene and lycopene very thoroughly. Organic versus non-organic, grains, plant families, making sense of food labels, psychological factors in health and healing, different perspectives on candida, DHA, xenoestrogens, and phytoestrogens. I cover a lot of case histories from my 4 years of clinical experience at True North in the juice and water fasting section. Dr. Karen covers a survey of superfoods and supplements in several sections where she distinguishes the marketing claims from the real science so you can make sense out of what is being said out there and know if it's really legit or not. Expanded raw food sources of nutrients, raw food exaggerations, the history of human food choices. Oh, there's competing thoughts out there. Was it meat that gave us a big brain? Was it starches? Was it fruit? She examines all of those very fairly and objectively so you have accurate information so you know what to do with. Big question of animal products, importance of sleep, menu planning for various health challenges. We've talked about the Healthy Foundation covers so many things across the board, but there are some nuances depending on the health challenge you're dealing with, and those are really important to know about. An expanded view of carbohydrates, raw food weight loss too. Dr. Karen looks at all the different sweeteners out there, and our bottom line is minimize or eliminate them, just eat fruits and vegetables, but if you want to make some of the fancier things, it's good to know what's going in there and what the best choices are. The importance of hydration, research in support of raw food nutrition. There's enough raw foodists out there in the world that researchers have studied them, and there's science behind it, and we can see what happens and make sense out of it. Nutrient analyses of various plant foods and then various sample diets. And we'll see even within raw food, there are some significant differences. And comparing raw food diets to whole food plant-based diets to standard American diets, it's very, very revealing. Then I've got 4 more hours on fatty acids, an advanced section where we look at omega-3 conversion and a whole bunch of case histories. We go on to an overview of energy where you look at all the mechanisms and what happens to fructose and fat and what are the metabolic pathways and how does that affect fat on our body. Sea vegetables, probiotics and prebiotics, the pleasure trap, extraordinary information borrowed from Drs. Doug Lyle and Alan Goldhammer. The autonomic nervous system, overcoming challenges and pitfalls in raw food nutrition. That summarizes a lot of the other sections and adds additional information to make sure you are fluent in all of these principles so you never have to get thrown off track. Then in the last quarter of the class, we go into our educator material. So whether you are somebody who wants to go out and educate others about plant-based and raw food nutrition, or just be able to speak to friends and family and coworkers with authority and be a good influence on them instead of them being a bad influence on you, this section is so important to bring things together and to give you that confidence so you won't be thrown off track. And Dr. Karen has a section on searching for information in the scientific literature after this class is over so you can continue, how to handle questions, how to put events together, all that kind of stuff to make sure you are incredibly solid. And no matter what your goal is for yourself or to educate others or just for your friends and family, by the time our students complete this course, their level of understanding and confidence in a whole food plant-based diet with a foundation of raw fruits and vegetables is extremely high. We send surveys out and ask people how much they learned, and most people say my level has skyrocketed, even if they have an extensive background already. They really appreciate the thorough and unbiased perspective that we share. And the thing is, our position is all you have to do is tell the truth, and the benefits of plant-based and raw food nutrition are naturally revealed. No outrageous claims, nothing crazy, just amazing health-supporting results. Many of you know Chris Kendall from YouTube and other social media, from fruit festivals. If you've listened to any of our summits in the past 5 years, you have likely heard from him. Chris took our class last year, and here's what he said in responding to our survey. Doctors Rick and Karen are literal gold mines for an up-to-date, unbiased, raw food and vegan nutritional education. I already had a strong foundation in these subjects and enjoy researching myself. But the way the Mastering Raw Food Nutrition is laid out and the depth that goes into the current science, coupled by their combined 60 years of experience, is next level. I feel blessed to have taken this class and know anyone seeking success with a raw/vegan diet or teaching it will benefit more than expected. So we're so happy to have Chris join us. It was kind of fun to have a raw food celebrity in class with us. Tamar from Israel says, the Mastering Raw Food Nutrition course is the best course I have ever had. Also, being vegan for almost 12 years and eating mostly raw for 4 years, and all that time doing my best for educating myself about the natural hygiene philosophy and about vegan and raw food lifestyles, the course gave me a strong foundation into the science and the history of the plant-based movement that I was looking for to be sure that I'm doing the right thing for me and my family. Thank you so much. And in another comment, she said, thanking you for making such a profound, comprehensive, and professional course. Susan from Idaho said, though I've been a raw food enthusiast for over 10 years, I never knew what I never knew. Doctors Rick and Karen taught me some key principles that were missing from my understanding of raw food nutrition. I'm grateful for both of you, who you are, and how much you use your wisdom and knowledge to support others in their path to greater health and vitality. Thank you so much. And Jackie said, get ready to learn lots about nutrition that you never knew existed. So it is incredibly detailed, incredibly thorough, incredibly comprehensive, and we lay it out in a way that makes sense. So if you're already concerned, oh, these people know so much already, don't worry. Even if you're not science-based, we lay it out in a way that everybody can understand. In fact, if you've been following the information in this webinar, you'll be able to follow the course videos. So the primary way that we deliver the content is through professional quality videos, similar to what you're seeing here. There's approximately 2 hours per week of videos. We break those down into 20 to 30 minute segments, so you don't have to watch everything all at once. You can re-watch these or listen, because we have the audio-only versions, as many times as you want. And actually, we're using a new delivery system this year that once you sign back in, wherever you left off, it will bring you to that exact point, so you don't have to remember again. So if you're busy and you want to cover things in bits and pieces, that is available to you. Now, the thing is, each 2 hours took us probably hundreds of hours worth of research to put together, and it cuts through the nonsense. It just delivers what's most important very efficiently and very clearly. It makes an incredibly good use of your valuable time. Along with the videos comes comprehensive notebooks. We send you 4 separate notebooks. Here they come throughout the year. There's over 900 pages of notes with thousands of scientific references that we used to put this curriculum together. Now, these notebooks are designed to complement the videos. They're not just transcripts of what we said. They have bullet points and charts and graphs. And the thing is, when you have your notebooks open, when you're listening and watching to the videos, everything makes sense, and you don't have to try to write everything down as quickly as possible. You can really pay attention to the videos and see what's in the notes and let all that sink in, because everything, just about everything, is in the notes. Some students fill in a little bit more, And then in addition to complementing the videos, once the course is over, these notebooks are lifetime reference material. So here is one of them, if I can line that up with the camera. And just to show you a few samples here, there are some of the things, if I can line that up. You see there's bullet points, there's charts, there's graphs. It's really easy to follow along. And then when you go to look some things up after the class is over or during the class, just to review a little bit, it's all laid out for you. And it's taken a huge amount of effort to coordinate that and put those notes together. But our students find them so incredibly valuable. We also have video conferences on Tuesdays, 2 different times, 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. Pacific time, which depending on where you are in the world, usually covers most people. So that's where we get together in small groups and we answer questions and have discussion about the course content. So you get direct interaction with Dr. Karen and I regularly, several times per month. Now, what's nice about this is even if you can't make one of the meetings or one of the times just doesn't work for you, you can submit your questions in advance of the call. We will answer them during the call, and we actually record and save each call. So you can submit your questions in advance and then listen to the recordings afterwards. And so it's almost in real time, but it's still direct interaction with Dr. Karen and I. And our students, a lot of them just absolutely love coming on the conferences and being able to clarify things and let everything sink in from their answering their own questions, us answering their own questions, as well as hearing questions and answers from other students. Now, one of the things we're improving this year is we're adding video conferencing. To make a long story short, our previous method allowed you to submit questions in advance, and then we could upload our very high quality recordings to our system. It did not allow for video conferencing, whereas the video conferencing systems would not allow you to upload the high quality recordings and not allow you to submit questions in advance, only during the call. But now that we're updating our delivery system, we have the capability of getting questions in advance and uploading the calls. Therefore, we're going to be having video conferencing and get the best of everything. So you get to see us on the calls also, and we'll each have about half the screen, and we can share our screens also to show notes and other things. You won't just see a little thumbnail of us in the top corner. Okay, so for the past 4 years, we've had a Facebook group. And the Facebook group largely helps to support the conference call topics. So a student has a question, whether they ask directly with their voice or they submit the questions in advance, we will often post things in the Facebook group to support answering the questions, some research articles, some websites, whatever the case may be. Students also get to know each other in the group. They share recipes, talk about some different things, and there's a general sense of support. Now, we know that many people are legitimately concerned about privacy issues. So another positive change that we're making for this year's class coming up in August of 2020 is we're going to have a private study group in place of the Facebook group. So let's get Facebook on out of there, and we're going to have a private study group which replaces the Facebook feature, but it's part of the course. You don't have to go somewhere outside of the course, and you don't have to worry about your personal information being sold or shared or getting bombarded with things that you don't want to see. You can just focus on the course material, and that's one of the changes we're actually really, really happy about for this upcoming year in our effort to constantly strive for excellence and deliver this in a way that makes sense to you and sinks in so you can use it, so you can get all the benefits for a lifetime of extraordinary health, all designed to help you. One of our students from this last year, Monica from Canada, says that she is not a scientific person, never cared much about science. That's why she felt it's a real challenge for her. She said Dr. Karen and Dr. Rick presented the course very well, so even I would actually understand. Their knowledge is so deep and very detail-oriented. They explained everything in the way everyone could understand, but at a professional level. I would recommend their course with love because I know their knowledge is so unique, and actually I feel lucky to have found them, and I was able to be a part of the 2018-19 class. Thank you for them to do all the research and nerdiness to be able to put together this beautiful course. She also said, keep up the excellent work. The world needs you, with a heart and a rainbow and a smiley sun there. So that's great. Now, another thing to consider here is that English is not Monica's first language, but she was still able to follow and understand everything between being able to watch the videos as many times as she wanted, hitting pause, going back, following along in the notebooks, and having the calls to be able to clarify everything. We have many students who English is not their first language. Pierre from Paris, France said, "This course is just amazing. The work that has been done is just phenomenal. It covers everything around raw food and plant-based diets. We receive what science knows today about food. It clears every misunderstanding about food and nutrition. I use the course as a database for every video, article, and seminar I can attend. Now I feel able to do my own research and to analyze better every scientific content. Thank you." So out of this solid foundation, he is truly becoming trend-proof. He uses what he learned in our course as a reference point and as context to plug everything else he comes across into to help determine if it makes sense or if it doesn't. Another point about exposure versus cohesion. There are courses out there where you hear from lots of different people, and yes, they're all plant-based, but they don't all have the exact same perspective. So on the one hand, Dr. Karen and I have diverse backgrounds. She went to naturopathic medical school for 2.5 years, for example, and learned some things that I didn't. She also did a summer preceptorship at True North, but that was just for a summer, whereas I was there for 4 years. Because of our different backgrounds, we each bring different things to the curriculum, but because we're a married couple and we love this stuff and this is what we do full time, everything revolves around the same template, and we make sure everything's integrated and it all works together and it all makes sense. So we love this stuff. We both have doctorate degrees. Karen sort of has 1 2/3 doctorate degrees and 2 undergrad degrees. And all that, our personal clinical experience, all comes together and integrates as a whole. It's another thing that helps cut through confusion. Anita from Croatia said, "The course was great. It really is a good investment in health and in life in general. Doctors Karen and Rick really are the masters of raw food. They feel very energetic and passionate about every topic and thus easily spread the knowledge to students. All of the topics are of high importance and have the strong ability to change people's life." And Anita has a PhD. She actually teaches full-time. She's a professor and teaches at a university, so she's involved full-time in academia. So that testimonial coming from an actual professor really means a lot to us. And our student base ranges from people with advanced doctorate degrees to people like Monica who aren't that into science, and we go to great lengths to make sure everybody can understand the information because it is so extremely valuable and life-enhancing. So to summarize how this is delivered, we've got our 2 hours of professional video content per week. You can also listen to the audio-only versions if you'd like, a feature we just added this year, if you like listening to podcasts or other information on the way to work or when you're out walking or when you're exercising. You can access the videos, but just the audio content, so you use a lot less mobile data. Also this year, we're adding interactive quizzes at the end of the content for each week, also to help enhance the learning process. We've got those thoughtfully designed notebooks for each subject that we mentioned to help follow along with the videos and for lifetime reference material. We have our near weekly video conferences. You can join us live, you can submit questions in advance, and you can listen to the recordings afterwards. And we have video conferencing this year with the ability to see us that we haven't had in the past. And then we also have our non-Facebook private study group, which takes the place of our previous Facebook group, but without the privacy concerns. Everything is fully private. All of this, again, is designed to make this make sense to you, so you're confident in it, so you implement it, so you can get all the benefits for a lifetime of supercharged health. Today we covered just a tiny bit of what is available in our Mastering Raw Food Nutrition curriculum, and there's so much more available for those of you willing to make the commitment to keep learning with us. Remember earlier when I showed you that photo of when I was overweight and having a bad allergy day? And based on the way I felt, I was really motivated to make some changes. I made the decision to change my course, and I am so glad that I did. Now it's time for you to make a decision. You're watching this webinar because you're interested in plant-based and raw food nutrition and taking your knowledge to the next level so you can supercharge your health and maintain it for a lifetime. At this point, you probably already have a good idea of if you'd like to continue your learning journey with us. Our next group program begins on August 26th of 2020, and it won't be offered again until late August of 2021. You can watch and listen to the course videos on your own schedule as many times as you'd like. This gives you plenty of time for the information to sink in. In addition to the comprehensive set of notes to help you follow along with the weekly videos and to be used as lifetime reference material, we have our near weekly video conferences in real time in small groups directly with us. Or as I mentioned, you could submit your questions in advance and listen to the recordings. The private study group is also there to support the learning process. We love connecting with our students and will be there with you the whole way for the entire 12 months. You can access the course anywhere you have an internet connection, which is most places on the planet. We'll be sending you an email shortly where we'll invite those of you who are really excited about the course to speak with us to answer any questions you have about the curriculum and the structure of the class to help determine if it's a good fit for you. You can also click on the schedule link that's on your screen right now. We look forward to speaking with you about your health goals and about how mastering raw food nutrition can help you achieve them. We're now going to take a 5-minute intermission. We'll be back in a few minutes to answer your questions, and in the meantime, please feel free to sign up for a time to speak with us.